Your phone and do not disturb? No? You want me to leave it away?
I see she. Hi, it's 6:30. For those of you just joining us, this is the Small Business Committee of Community Board 8 Manhattan, and we're waiting for the controller of the City of New York to join us. That's Controller Brad Lander. So if you just stay patient, thank you.
Alita, while we're waiting, do you want me to give the introductions of
Yes,
I
please.
mean
Thank you.
instructions, sorry.
Yes, thank you. I knew what you meant. Thank you.
Welcome. If this is your first time joining us virtually, you will notice that you're currently muted and that everyone will remain muted throughout the meeting except the committee coaches Bill, Angelos, and Alita Camp and our presenters. Following the presentations and as we move through the agenda, the co-chairs will call on members of the public who wish to speak. You can participate by going to the reactions icon on your device and pressing the raise hand button, not the wave or the thumbs up, as those would disappear. Only press it once. If you press it a second time, your hand will go back down. If you're calling in on the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. Please be on the lookout for a prompt asking you to confirm unmuting once one of the co-chairs calls on you. The chat is available for technical support only, not to help with Zoom software problems. Sorry, the chat is available for technical support only to help with Zoom software problems, not to ask questions of the co-chairs or the presenters, as they won't see these chats. If you're using an older version of Zoom, you will need to go to the participants section where you find the raise hand feature there. Please do not raise your actual hand or wave at the screen because we may not be able to see you. Chat me, I'm here for support. In the meantime, Alita and Bill, back to you.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you too, Will.
Thank you. And we're joined by the controller.
Oh, excellent. Right on time. Thank you very much, Controller Lander. My name is Alita Camp. I'm co-chair of the Small Business Committee along with Bill Angelos. This is what we see as an informational meeting to provide some context and some information about the possibility of commercial rent. Asking the question is if it's appropriate. To that end, and to start the meeting off, I'd like to introduce Valerie Mason, the chair of Community Board 8. Valerie, to you.
Thank you, Alita. We're very happy to have everyone tonight at our Small Business Committee meeting. I just want to start with a little history about our controller's public service history prior to being elected controller in 2021. He spent 12 years in the city council representing District 39, which included Brooklyn's Cobble Hill, Carroll Gardens, Gowanus, and Borough Park neighborhoods, among others. And I am happy to say in 2021, prior to his election, I was happy to welcome him to our East 72nd Street Neighborhood Association Day of Cleanup. Controller Lander serves as New York City's Chief Financial Officer. As investment advisor and custodian for the city's public pension funds, he stewards the retirement security of over 750,000 current and retired public sector workers. He is our city's budget watchdog and chief accountability officer. Since he took office, the controller's audits revealed nearly $250 million of underreported New York City ferry expenditures, inadequate cost controls in COVID-19 emergency procurement, and the ineffectiveness of the city's homeless sweeps. His team published the first detailed report on emergency shelter costs for asylum seekers and identified more effective strategies for addressing the humanitarian crisis. His office launched the Department of Correction dashboard to much needed transparency into city jails, and his initiative with Mayor Adams to pay nonprofit human service providers on time has reduced nearly year-long payments. As a member of one of the boards of those not-for-profits incurring interest on loans to pay our workers, I have to thank you personally for that, Controller Lander. We are very happy to have you here with us. It is a rare occurrence that we have a citywide office holder at one of our meetings, and we are really excited to have you. And we hope this is the first of many visits to Community Board 8. Thank you very much, Controller Lander. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Valerie. I really appreciate that lovely introduction. I'm sorry for challenges getting my video set up here, but hopefully you guys can see and hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this invitation. It really is nice to get to talk not just to a community board, but to one of the committees that's really digging in on a critical issue facing the city. And you really covered a bunch of the things that we're doing in the controller's office, to attend to broader issues of the city's economy, to drill down on the budget and focus on the ways that we can make government work better for New Yorkers and help ensure a flourishing economy as well. And yes, it's really at all those different levels. It's like, why does it take so long to pay the contracts? And how are we settling claims against the city? And, what of these different programs could be run more efficiently? And I was delighted to get this invitation, which honestly relates back as much to my days in the city council, though it is of course, a crucial issue affecting the city's economy, and that's the state of our small businesses, and something I feel really passionate about. I know all of you guys do. So yeah, let me just maybe kind of give a quick overview of how I see the issue, and then really happy to kind of dive in and both answer questions, but also hear a little about how you guys are thinking about it at Community Board 8. And, so yeah, I mean, on the one level, I think we feel about this, I'm guessing sort of the same way. Our small businesses, especially our kind of mom and pop businesses, are so critical to what make New York City's neighborhoods what we love. They're vital for the economy. They are what makes it different to live in New York, that you have this opportunity to live in neighborhoods where you can walk to stores, where you could be a regular, where you could get to know mom and pop owners. They're vital for the economy. The huge percentage of the jobs that New Yorkers have are at these small businesses, even as, of course, so much is driven, by the business centers of large businesses in finance and insurance and real estate and tech. But boy, it is, and this was true well before the pandemic, extremely difficult to operate a small business in New York City, and especially in high rent neighborhoods where the commercial rent is just so expensive, even though the things you're selling aren't. You can't charge more. A restaurant in Park Slope where I live or on the Upper East Side, sure, it could charge a little more than a restaurant in a lower rent neighborhood, but it's still the same market where people are getting their retail goods and services. So this, what you've long had is a big challenge of being able to afford retail and commercial rents. And this really was exacerbated by a bunch of dynamics in the goods and services economy. Obviously, the shift to online shopping, even before the pandemic, made this worse and much more challenging. And then you had what I think of as the banks and drugstores issue that really affected the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side, and some downtown Brooklyn neighborhoods. The thing about banks and drugstores is that they ostensibly are retail businesses. They want to locate in high foot traffic neighborhoods, but they don't make their money on the retail transactions by kind of selling what's in the store. Banks make their money on the mortgages and the loans and the businesses they'll get. And in some ways, their retail branches are a little like giant ATMs. They need to offer customer services, but they could pay a lot more in rent because they're essentially not the same kind of retail business. And truthfully, the same with pharmacies, who make most of their money on the prescriptions and not on the retail goods they sell, even though what you need in your neighborhood is the retail goods that they sell. This actually led to something that Gail Brewer and I worked on together, which was a zoning effort to say, okay, you just can't have banks and pharmacies as every retail operation. And she actually got mapped on the Upper West Side in a couple of blocks, a zoning district that does that. And that made a little difference in limiting the number of banks and drugstores, but it's not like it really helped all the other kinds of small businesses that we want to see flourish. So you had all of those challenges before the pandemic, and then of course the pandemic put those things just on steroids in a whole different way. Of course, closed all the businesses down right at the beginning, and that challenge of just having for small business people, even if they were able to get the PPP money, the pandemic loans, just the challenges of operating and kind of figuring out how to stay open in those early days when everything shut down. Was just so difficult for people. And that was true everywhere. But then in neighborhoods, so proximate to Midtown and business districts as yours, had this additional challenge of the shift to work from home. And so in what we saw in New York City was that 2020 was, of course, the most devastating year for small businesses, basically ever. But in 2021 and 2022, in the outer boroughs, you actually saw unprecedented new business openings as certain kinds of businesses opened up a lunch counter or, a new florist or something that benefited from having more people working from home. But those small businesses that are in or had long served people who were coming into business districts, we saw a decline. So, several recent studies have shown that while we saw small business growth now beyond its pandemic levels, basically in all the outer boroughs, that we still are not back to the small business levels that we saw. So
I think you're cutting out.
well, doesn't it make sense for that building to? Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes. we can
Now,
hear you
but you
now.
had cut out.
Okay, great. Sorry. So that even in places where you might think that it would make sense for a commercial landlord to drop the rent because they're having a hard time. You got a Class B or C office building. They have more vacancies. They've got a vacancy downstairs. Couldn't they just drop the rent a little? That still largely doesn't happen because the way their financing is structured, renting to a small mom and pop, it's just kind of not how their business model works. So all these challenges stack up together. We had proposed some creative things during the pandemic, but I think now it's really time, as you know, things are shifting to the new normal of remote and hybrid work, to figure out, okay, how do we come back now and really address this set of longstanding issues? So I'm excited that you guys are looking at it. The one you specifically asked me to talk about, and I'll just do this for a minute and then we can get into questions, is why I supported the, what is traditionally called commercial rent control, or what got called in the council the Small Business Jobs Survival Act. And I will say I supported a particular version here, which is not that there was an earlier version which required arbitration that I thought was, raised a series of constitutional problems and legal problems, and also would just be very difficult to implement. But then Councilmember Steve Levin introduced a bill in 2021, I want to say, maybe it was in earlier than that, but in that term, that did not require kind of arbitration, and that did not guarantee you automatic rights on renewal, but basically just set a ceiling on how much a commercial rent could go up each year, not just of a lease, but kind of in the way that residential rent stabilization works. A board would just say, okay, costs have increased this year, and so it's reasonable for landlords to increase the commercial rents by X percent, whatever that would be, 3-4% that year, but not above that. And we did a lot of looking at this, and because it doesn't require the arbitration, because it doesn't require a lease renewal, our lawyers at the city council concluded that it would survive a court challenge and yet provide protections to those. And this was for relatively small retail spaces. I think it was under 25,000 square feet, but it might even have been under 10,000 square feet. The idea here really is to protect those kind of mom and pop small businesses that are just the lifeblood of our neighborhood and have a hard time making it in high rent neighborhoods otherwise. So I was proud to sign onto that bill as a co-sponsor. I thought maybe we could get it done in my time in the council. I think it would be a great thing for this council to consider, though I certainly am open to other solutions and ideas, and I welcome hearing what you guys and other people are thinking, because if we could use this opportunity to do some things that would make it easier for small businesses to flourish in places like the East Side and throughout New York City, it would be one of the answers to kind of getting back to, in many ways, jobs are now back above their pre-pandemic levels. There's a lot of good things happening in the New York City economy, but we know we have not yet really restored that sense of New York City's neighborhoods to where we want them to be. That's a much bigger issue that's got to do, of course, with public safety and sanitation and a whole range of other issues, but preserving the stability and flourishing of our neighborhood, small businesses, mom and pop retail, is one critical element. So I was delighted to get this invitation and be happy both to answer some questions, but also to hear what you guys are thinking about, and see how our office might be able to contribute.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brad. We are concerned about small businesses, and it comes up really frequently. Before we turn to the public and the board for some questions, I think Bill and I have a couple of questions to ask you, but we're very grateful for the interest of you and your office in helping preserve small businesses, and even more than preserve them, to help them thrive. I know you have a limited amount of time, and we're really grateful again that you're here. So I'll just say, Bill, you've got a question, at least one, I know.
Okay, thank you. If a real estate owner will come to you and say, why we interfere in the market, and the market does the job of self-regulated under the basic law of supply and demand, how would you respond to that?
Well, I would sure understand why they felt that way. It's not easy to be a commercial land, a business in general in New York is not easy. It's not easy to be a mom and pop small business. Boy, these days, it's sure not easy to be an owner of a Class B or Class C office building. But I guess I would say, there are some market challenges in the ways that the market works, especially in neighborhoods where residential rents are high and you wind up with all these retail and commercial vacancies, which for any individual landlord might just be the thing that sort of makes sense to them to do, to wait to see, when they could get a credit tenant who might have a big lease for 20 years. Maybe they could get the next bank or the next pharmacy, but it adds up to a real problem in neighborhoods that mean that neighborhoods wind up with tons of retail vacancies. And similarly, that a small business who's put their life savings and blood, sweat, and tears into helping build a neighborhood, and now because a bank or a pharmacy is willing to pay twice as much in rent as they can, is going to lose all that. There are a set of things we balance when we kind of regulate an economy and neighborhoods, and providing some price stability, for those small businesses on small retail spaces. It's a balance, and I understand why a landlord might not like it on their individual site, but I guess I would ask them to look and see at the bigger picture of a neighborhood in a flourishing city. So reasonable regulation, they'll be able to cover their cost increases. What we would wind up with, I think, is just a much more vibrant streetscape and set of neighborhoods that we would all benefit from.
Okay, I know you have limited time. I have additional question, but before I go to my question, I'd like to go to the member of the public.
Well, before we do that, I also have a question,
I'm
and then I
sorry.
have a lot more. That's okay. And I know people have been raising their hands, and I thank you. You mentioned that it will lead to more stability if there's a rent control in the neighborhood, but if there's no automatic renewal, what stops a landlord from, instead of renewing a lease, just refusing to renew it and then leasing that same space to a bank or a drugstore or a chain?
The way that the legislation that Council Member Levin had introduced, it's true that the tenant, the commercial tenant, wouldn't have a right to renewal. Basically, that was what the lawyers said was necessary to have a bill that would pass. But the rent, the increase on a rent limit would still cover that new tenant. So it's not like it was not vacancy decontrol. It wasn't a.
Oh, we lost you for a second.
Would be a lot less incentive to throw them out.
We lost you, I think, for that whole explanation. You were
I'm so sorry. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so while you would not have an automatic lease renewal, it also was not vacancy decontrol. So if the rent was allowed to be $10,000 one year and it could go up by 5%, that would be true whether you kept your existing tenant in or whether you threw them out and brought in the bank. So there will be a lot less incentive to get rid of your existing small tenant if the rent increase that you were going to get wasn't that significant anyway. So we thought that it would provide good protection for existing small businesses within the confines of what the lawyers felt would survive legal challenge.
And that makes a lot of sense, and I could see that happening. Thank you. Then let's go to Elaine Walsh from the public. And if anyone else from the public has any questions, please do raise your hand using the reaction button. If you could unmute Elaine, Robert, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Brad, for coming. I have a comment and then a couple of questions. When the federal government allowed co-ops to have additional income, it impacted the retail space for those buildings. And we saw it change in that there was not the renewal of long-term tenants. Is there something that we can do as a city? One. Two, looking at the ownership of property, we also have nonprofit institutions that have retail space, commercial space up in Washington Heights, I'll mention Coogan's, where they are not controlled by any kind of restriction and will charge whatever they think without attention to the community. What is it we can do there? And then my third question is there an incentive for landlords to keep their retail empty? Are there any limitations on that? Or is there something we as a city, or you, not me, I can't do it, can do to enhance the landlord's renting? And if not, there's some fine or limitation on their real estate deduction. Thank you.
I'll take the last question first. I mean, there's not really an incentive to keep your property vacant. And you can take depreciation on your property, whether it's vacant or occupied. You know, you can take depreciation. That's
Right.
under federal tax law, and we're definitely not going to be able to change that. And of course, people wait thinking they're going to get like a great credit tenant if they wait. One idea that was pitched a few years ago that I really liked was to have what someone called I can't remember, it was like a good landlord, good neighbor. It was like a model of a tax incentive that basically would have said to a property owner, okay, if you keep a long-time small business tenant at what's effectively a below market rent, the city would give you a small, some modest discount from your property taxes. That sounds like a great idea. It obviously would be very hard to implement. Like, how do you know what's really below market and what's really a mom and pop? So I really liked that idea, but I never saw it quite worked out well enough to figure out how it could be implemented, though I still think that would be a nice idea. And yeah, I mean, as I recall about Councilmember Levin's bill, it was irrespective of what kind of landlord there was. So it would have covered Columbia or a nonprofit institution. I know co-ops and condos are especially challenging, but that legislation would have covered them as well.
Okay, if there's no other question for the members of the public, we go to the board members. So Barbara Rutter, you're up. Barbara?
Yeah, I got it. Sorry. I click too quickly sometimes. Thank you so much. I've been interested in small business for a long, long time. I was at a meeting with Gail Brewer discussing, how horrible landlords are and big rent. And I got up and I said, a big issue is that we go on Amazon instead of going to our local stores. And there was like a minute of silence. Gail said, absolutely, I preach this all the time. And the moderator of the panel stopped and said, but it's so easy to go on Amazon. I have a couple of prejudices. One is I do have trouble. I don't understand, and I'm not commenting on rent control for stores because I don't fully understand it. I will say I have trouble with rent control, rent stabilization on apartments. Everything I've read said that rents generally would be down if we didn't have this. And I will say, as somebody that's not in rate stabilized, I'm prejudiced against. I own my apartment. When I hear elected say, we're wonderful for tenants and come to us and we have free legal care, it's only if you're rent stabilized. We have SCREE, only if you're rent stabilized. So I really would like to be careful with what we do and make sure that small landlords, not everybody is an Excel, and small landlords aren't stuck 20 years from now with something that's going down. We know that we go through cycles where we have nail salons and banks and pharmacies. Dwayne Reeds are going out. Our pharmacies are leaving. The banks have been closing. And so I think that it's not the same problem as it was before. I see two problems. One is I think we have to change our shopping. So what has happened before for COVID, I almost never used Amazon. I loved going to the local store. There was, as an example, Leitner's on 86th Street that I went in for one item and came out with 5 because the stuff was so good. The one last houseware store in the neighborhood is gone. If I wanted a sheet, I have to go online. I have no choice at this point. And it really is heartbreaking for me because I love the small things. So one of the things, in fact, Alita and I offline had discussed, how do we encourage stores to open up that really will serve, not more restaurants. I love restaurants, but not against it, but the houseware store, the place to buy socks if you want to buy socks someplace, the stuff that we really do need. And what has to be the other side is go through a campaign to say, don't go to your computer, go to the store, you'll do better. And I could tell you stories of stores that I know closed because they charged a little bit more because they had the service and everything, and they had to go out of business because people were buying online instead. The second problem I have, and I could use 86th Street, 3rd Avenue as an example, we get either there are stores that are just for years, like the movie theater. I don't know why, maybe Elaine knows why, but I don't know why that can't be rented and why it has to look so ugly. So we have stores that are not rented, but we also have stores that were so hopeful to be rented, like H Mart on 86th Street, or the new Orange Julius, or whatever it's called, whatever it's that hot dog place that was supposed to open up, and it's in construction for years. And I don't know what to do about it, why it happens. What can we do to say you have to maintain it? It is a question for me, and I wish I could go back to saying I never have to go on Amazon because I will shop locally instead, and I can't because we don't have the stores to support it.
All right, I want to be so I just have about 4 or 5 minutes left, so I can give an answer to that, or I could listen to the other folks with hands up and then try to do an answer,
Up to you.
kind of answer all the. Why don't I take the other hands that are up, and I'll definitely work an answer to your question at the end. So yeah, folks could just maybe, I don't know, 1-minute questions from the remaining folks, and then I'll try to give a good
Okay.
answer that wraps up all of those.
Okay, we go to Rita Papa.
Hi, Brett. Thank you so much. It was really quite informative. I have a question. How many years does a vacant store owner get as a tax abatement for not renting? Is there an incentive not to rent?
Would you like to answer that? Go to the next question.
Why don't we go to the rest
Go to
of
the next
Okay.
question, then I'll come back and pick them all up at the end.
Okay, well, Michelle Birnbaum.
Thank you, and thank you, Comptroller, for being here. So landlords too are the backbone of the economy of this city. Granted that the bigger landlords have more control over what they charge, the kind of profit they want to make. At what size builder or developer or landlord do you consider to be a small business? Because some of them are small businesses too. That would be one question. Do you actually have a parameter? In other words, if this law or a law like it were in effect, would somebody who owns one building who actually supports his whole family on that building, is he under the same consideration as some of the larger developers, or does this or any of these bills account for that? And the other thing is that if a landlord is not incentivized to rent his property, then there's a reason, whether it be a tax abatement, whether it be offsetting it against other properties that he may not even have in New York, that he may have in other parts of the country or in other parts of the world. And somehow this makes sense to keep it vacant. How would having a control on the rent necessarily encourage him to actually rent it if the benefit of keeping it empty was the benefit. And the other thing is
let's try,
there, well,
let's try.
last question, sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to.
Yeah,
I'm
the
sorry to
last
interrupt, but I
question
gotta
is
jump.
there
So
a
let me go ahead and
term?
answer the
We
questions.
have Valerie Mason.
Okay,
Well, you know what, but wait, Valerie, if you could be really fast, because I know the controller
Yeah.
said he has to jump so quick, please.
I just want to put in a plug for Manhattan here. I mean, you mentioned that, COVID, a lot of businesses were growing in the outer boroughs. And one of the things, I mean, just like after 9/11, the commercial rent tax was removed from downtown. I was just wondering if the controller's office could look at what the benefit would be to removing the commercial rent tax in our neighborhoods in Manhattan, because I really feel like we have been suffering since COVID, and everyone is excited that the outer boroughs are growing, but nobody seems to be interested in the number of businesses that are leaving Manhattan. And in conjunction with that, I don't really understand why the relocation and employment assistance program was even re-upped, because that moves businesses out of Manhattan. And then lastly, combined with that, what is the controller's office looking at in terms of the effect that congestion pricing will have on the moving of businesses out of Manhattan? So I'll end with that.
All right. That's a lot of questions, and I will run through as many as I can. First, I will say there is not a financial incentive to keep your storefront vacant. I know it seems like there must be, or why would people do it? But there really isn't. You're allowed to depreciate, to write losses of a property that you have off against other income, but it's still better to have income than to write losses off against other income that you have. It is a feature of federal tax law that's not going to change in any case, but there isn't an incentive for vacancies. There's reasons people keep their properties vacant, that they believe they'll be able to get a higher rent with a longer term and a credit tenant later, or that they just don't believe the headache or the work they would have to do justifies the expenses. If you've got a big residential building, you might be making plenty of money on your residential rents, but there's not, and it's just a different business in some ways, that it brings challenges and headaches, but there's not a financial incentive. I think it's a good idea to look at REAP and why we still have it, given the shifts that you described. So we're looking currently at a couple of different tax exemptions, like the Fresh program, and trying to evaluate whether they're really still worth it. But maybe I'll see if we could get REAP in line. And I hear you about the commercial rent tax, which, your Manhattan elected officials have done a good job of pushing back out sometimes. And I sure understand why this would be a moment. Sorry, I sure understand why this would be a moment that there would be a push for that. On the kind of the other questions, I mean, I really appreciate the challenge that building property owners and landlords of all kinds face. They're not responsible for these challenges. This isn't about victimizing or demonizing people. This is, I guess, what I would say. Oh, and one more thing on the shift. One nice thing is that, yes, many of the kinds of goods that used to be bought at a neighborhood store, people get online. And I think we all have this challenge. We love neighborhoods with mom and pops, but pretty much we all buy things that we might have gotten at mom and pops on the internet sometimes, or a lot of the time. That's just human nature. The question is, if we also want our neighborhoods to have vibrant street life and small businesses, because we love being in neighborhoods that have that, how does that work? Now, one good thing is you've seen a shift to different kinds of businesses, right? Like, 20 years ago, there wasn't a yoga studio, and there weren't certain kinds of service businesses that have come to be thriving parts of neighborhoods. Thankfully, some things, like think about neighborhood bookstores, have almost shifted from being a goods purchase to being a certain kind of neighborhood service, store. You have events, essentially, like bookstores that have succeeded have largely shifted to becoming active event spaces. So thankfully, we've got really creative entrepreneurs who come up with ideas that can fill up commercial and retail spaces with vibrant businesses. And luckily, we don't ask the government to do that because we would not be good at that. But we want to make room for those things to thrive. And I guess when I say stability, what I mean is this. I'm not saying we know what should go there or that we can change the fundamental economics. But if you have a small business who has invested in, fitting out the space, building up a customer base, and starting their business and becoming a part of the neighborhood, I guess I think it's reasonable that rather than leaving them vulnerable to the possibility that something could happen that would enable that space to rent for twice as much, that the next year they're going to have to pay more than they did this year, but only by a modest amount. And yes, that limits the possibility, because if that landlord could instead have said, yeah, I know we've had this bookstore here, but now a bank or a pharmacy is just willing to pay me twice as much, we are limiting this law would limit their ability to do it, not taking away their ability to collect rent or even to raise the rent, but it provides a protection for a kind of long time neighborhood business. Now, I'd be open to a version that, figured out how to define something that was an independently owned small business or a mom and pop. So it's not just a restriction on the landlord for a business that's of a particular size in square footage, but that actually has definitions for what an independently owned small business is. So it would be relatively narrowly tailored. Now, how fair is that? Because one landlord has a business that meets the test of independently owned small business, and the next one, it's a franchise. And so that franchise is not necessarily protected. These are complicated questions, and Councilmember Levin's bill, which I don't think has been reintroduced in that same form, answered some of them. I think a robust debate about how to get there is really worth it, and I'm glad you're kickstarting it. I guess I think the restrictions on property owners to enable independently owned small businesses to have that stability in our neighborhoods, it's an impingement that's worth having for something we would all collectively benefit from in the ways that neighborhoods thrive. I appreciate the arguments on the other side of this. I'm not like dogmatic about this. These are really hard problems to solve. I'll ask my team to kind of dig in again and see, because I think you're right that things have really shifted from when we were having this debate before the pandemic. Things look very different given the work from home economy, a whole range of new things. I'm glad we're picking this conversation back up because doing what we can to ensure, kind of a thriving street culture and small business life is a really critical thing. So I am going to go now, but I'm so grateful for this invitation.
Before you run, could we invite you back for another meeting to continue this discussion? And also, just on the point of a vibrant street life, one thing that's happened around here, which is with the demolition of the walk-ups and the tenement buildings and those small businesses, the large residential development does not have any real street life aspect in terms of small businesses. They don't allocate their massive lobby space to supporting small businesses in most instances. So that's one thing I've noticed. And the other one is I was so saddened in the East Village to see a national hamburger chain in the midst of the small mom and pops on 2nd Avenue below 10th Street. But we would love to have you back because obviously you've given this quite a lot of thought. And one thing to attack is what is different now that may enable such a bill to get passed that didn't exist in 2019, for instance. So if we could work with your scheduler or Evelyn, who's just been a delight, maybe we could organize our schedule to suit yours.
I would love to come back as you guys have some new ideas as well. I think this is a good conversation to keep going. And yes, Evelyn will continue to stay in touch and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you so much for giving us your time.
you
Wherever
for your
you are,
time.
have a good time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Michelle.
Thank you. I wonder if the office can send us the bills. The implication is that there were two.
There was one, I believe, Bill also did some research, and Evelyn from the controller's office sent over the bill from 2019. I think Robert, well, Evelyn,
Yep, the
could you unmute Evelyn because she could address this? Thanks, Robert.
Right. So there are a few bills. There was an initial form of that bill that was more similar to the one that was introduced in the 80s. Is the SBJSA, the Small Business Survival Job Survival Act, which is the one that he referenced. And then there is Levin's bill from 2019. And then there are some bills that are post-pandemic. They're related to post-pandemic business revitalization in New York City. And then there are some bills that tackle the question of commercial rent by, just looking at certain businesses. I think one is the one that Councilmember Manning mentioned, reference at one of your meetings. I saw it on the notes, but I can definitely send you. And there are some bills at the state also in the assembly, so I can put something together and send it to you.
I would appreciate that very much to read the bills. And also it would help us to see the iteration. In other words, the bills from a while back, what's changed, and to sort of understand the progression of this. So if you could send that along to the office and they can forward, that would be terrific. Thank you very much.
Sure thing.
That's a great idea, Michelle and
Yes.
Evelyn. Thank you for really being so helpful with all of this and working with Bill and me in this. Are there other comments from the public or questions or ideas about next steps? Because Bill and I have been talking, and I've been talking a little bit with Valerie in terms of future meetings and having a discussion with having a robust pros and cons of starting with the idea of commercial rent control or rent control for small business. Because Michelle, you raised a lot of questions about landlords. Barbara, you raised other questions. There are different issues of franchises, which are individually owned, but yet they're controlled or feed a lot of profits to national chains. And how do you define all of this? There have been some really good law review articles, one in favor and one opposed to it, that Bill and I have been reading. So there's plenty of opportunity for discussion and for bringing people in on both sides of the issues to be able to continue this. Barbara?
I just have one quick question and then one suggestion. A quick question is, why would a landlord rent to a small, I don't know, somebody that sells like lower level, everyday children's clothing, if they know that they're very limited with what they have? If they sell to somebody else, they could get more. I think it may limit what we want rather than, but I don't know. That's just a thought, and I'm not sure how I would do it. I would like to, in addition to this, and I'm not saying not pursuing this, but something we had talked about is how can we talk about changing the mentality of having people actually go to our small business. Remember, we had that conversation. It was sort of with the Environment Committee to say that Amazon is causing an environmental problem and so on, the deliveries. I think that I know that the Madison Avenue bid does a great job of going out and getting people. There are the bids, there's the other places that maybe would have ideas of campaigns to say shop locally.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Actually, the New York Times published a letter I wrote about asking for people to go shopping in response to an op-ed piece by someone talking about the last mile environmental damage that ordering from Amazon does, for instance, with truck deliveries. So it's an important issue. And surely that would contribute to a vibrancy in New York's retail landscape that I think we could all use, and making neighborhoods different from each other, differentiating neighborhoods by the businesses that there are. Evelyn, I know you work with the controller on this, and I know that you've thought about it. If you want to jump in at any point, let's leave Evelyn unmuted, and you should just feel free. You have a lot of knowledge here. Not
Can
to
I
put you
just
on
say
the
one
spot,
other,
Evelyn,
I'd
but if
like to add one
want
other plus for what I'm saying. I do walk a lot, and I will say when there's a store, there's lights on. When there's no store, it's dark. And I think we all feel safer. When there's a store, they tend to clean the streets more than when there's not a store. So I think that there's a lot of pluses to having a vibrant in every single way. That will be good.
agreed for sure.
Mhm.
Rita, and then Michelle.
I just have a question. We just learned, well, I just learned about all these bills that exist. If, are they still operative, or have they sunset and they no longer exist? I don't know the answer. You know, because we seem to be reinventing the wheel all the time. If there are bills that exist, are they still active?
So the way it works is that every council session, is 4 years. So every session has to, at the end of that session, would have to reintroduce the bill for it to be considered active. So this bill, I don't think has been reintroduced for the session that started in 2022. The SBJSA definitely was not reintroduced. Is a more controversial, bill than Levin's bill of 2019. So that one was, encounter a lot of legal challenges because it is considered unconstitutional to regulate commercial rent, and this was like a complete sort of redesign of how commercial rent arbitration would be conducted and so on. So this is a great opportunity for CB8 to lobby a council member, specifically somebody like Pierina Sanchez, who sits at the housing committee at the New York City Council, to sit down with her and pick her brain to use an expression about how she feels about commercial rent.
So basically, we really are reinventing the wheel every 4 years.
Is being introduced since 1984, I believe, was the first time that it was introduced. Is, like I said, is a very controversial bill, but there are a lot of bills that have addressed different aspects of that problem, mostly through the post-pandemic revitalization. So a lot of things have changed, and a lot of perspective have changed in the context of where the city is at this time and where it was in 2021. So a lot of things that were considered not doable are all of a sudden looked at in a different way. So it's always worth the effort when yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I just have a follow-up question. The bill that was proposed that concerned about the constitutionality is for a permanent basis. Have there ever been thought to offer on a temporary basis to go around the constitutionality?
You said the temporary basis of
The concern that it will be a constitutional issue if it's on a permanent basis. Instead of a permanent, how about introduce legislation on a temporary basis, on a set timeline, like 2 or 3 years instead?
I mean, that could be a way to look at it, but I don't know that we would get a lot done if landlords are only required to comply with certain requirements within a certain, amount of, like, a short amount of time. Is that what you mean? I don't,
Yes.
yeah. So I don't know that in the long term, that's a strategy that would, really impact the issue of, very high rents in the commercial space. But I think doing away with the arbitration clause was like change a lot of perspectives from, the usual opposition to the bill. So, I mean, there are different ways that we can address, the same problem.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to the member of the public, Vivian.
The Small Business Job Survival Act in its original form was introduced by Ruth Messenger in the City Council in 1986. It is still waiting to go to committee. New York had commercial rent control for 18 years, from 1945 to 1963. And the Small Business Job Survival Act, in conjunction with rent control, which are two different things, would give commercial tenants a way to start a business at a location and build on it. Rent control addresses the amount of the rent, but if they don't have the right to an automatic renewal, unless there's a reason not to renew, then they'll be investing in the business and losing it, which is what's happening nowadays. A lot of businesses fold when their lease expires. With the Small Business Job Survival Act, there's the right to renew, and the amount of the increase is addressed. It's addressed even more with commercial rent control. So a combination of the two would really help businesses get started again, especially post-pandemic. And also, retail businesses are not the only commercial tenants. There are artist studios, small offices, places of instruction, all kinds of services, manufacturing. So there are a lot of small businesses who are prospective commercial tenants that could really get the economy going if they can afford to have a space and the promise of continuously being able to afford a space.
Right. So you raise a lot of interesting points that are worthy of a much lengthier discussion with people who are knowledgeable or have experienced this maybe in other jurisdictions. We're hoping to have Ruth Messenger actually come to a future meeting to be able to discuss some of the points that you've raised. And yes, it was a surprise to me to learn that there was rent control for commercial space in New York State. I think it followed on the heels of World War II and was considered an emergency measure, which is why it slowly faded out to finally not be renewed in 1963. But and I'd be interested to hear from other people about how the landscape has changed, and maybe for the controller to come back and talk about, or a city council member, why it's different, why the landscape is different now than it was in 2019, and what might merit more and new consideration of all of this. And I hope, I am so bad at names that Vivian, I think it was, when we meet again, that you'll be able to join us and contribute to the discussion. Evelyn, you have your hand up again, and then maybe we could go also to Olympia. Is that all right, Bill?
Yeah, I just want to quickly correct the information. I mentioned the chairperson for the housing committee, but you should getting a meeting with Councilmember Oswald Felix. He's the chairperson of the Committee on Small Businesses, and both of them will be ideal. I know Pierina has a lot of experience with housing, but yeah, small business, Councilmember Oswald Felix.
Okay, that's great. I'm making notes, so we're going to do this, and I'll be emailing you as well, Evelyn. Thank you. If we could go to Olympia, Kazi?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I mean, first of all, thank you so much for hosting this meeting and for having this conversation. And thank you to Bill for bringing it to my attention. So I am actually a founding member of the New York City Artists Coalition and the Music Workers Alliance. And we are the people who worked originally with Steve Levin for the introduction of Intro 1796, for which Brad was talking earlier. I wanted just to say that it was introduced actually in the previous session by the Deputy Speaker, Diana Ayala. And I know someone was asking, are we reinventing the wheel? We also had worked and testified on the Small Business Job Survival Act and have discussed it with Ruth Messenger. There is a big coalition of groups, of economic development groups, arts and culture, vibrancy groups that have been advocating and working in the trenches and reaching out to some community boards. So it's great to know you guys are also interested on this issue. And I can send a lot of links. I can already put, for instance, the introduction link for your coordinator that was reintroduced in 2022 by the Deputy Speaker. And you asked so many great questions today. I'm going to give just the major, points of information. That is, one, it was reintroduced. Two, it had 25 co-sponsors. But I'm actually, even though it says I can direct message the coordinator, it's not leaving. Anyway, I can email Bill the actual links of these bills. However, what I wanted to tell you is that the Small Business Job Survival Act, actually, the problem that was an issue was not really constitutionality. It had to do with the state actually oversees certain areas, and automatic renewal was a complicated part. However, the real reason for which advocates ended up pushing for commercial rent stabilization instead of the Small Business Job Survival Act, because a lot of our groups were before working on that issue and then moved, was that we felt arbitration was arbitrary in the sense that it wouldn't be addressing, you basically hire an arbiter and it's not given that you would be protected equally depending of your means and situations, etc. And we wanted to create an equitable landscape. A lot of the issues that you raised today have been debated for hours with so many great legal minds. And so there are reasons for every language, every word you're going to see on those bills. There is a reason we have it that way. I mean, I just wanted to make sure that you knew this is not as dead as it sounded. It is happening. There are a lot of people. We had rallies with hundreds of people even last year. Because our small businesses need a fundamental protection. Just in the last 2 weeks, I don't know if you read the news, there is the story of the 70-year-old pork shop in Ridgewood, the story of the 20-year-old bagel store, and the 50-year-old dive bar in East Village. They all have seen their rent overnight triple. Now, how is this possible, right? In the bagel store, by the way, to be rented to another bagel store. So totally ripping off their equity, right? The fact that they know this is a known destination for bagels. So I really thank you for hosting this conversation today. And Bill has my contact information, and I'm happy to forward you, all the information that you've been asking for, or bring more of the advocates to another meeting and have a bigger conversation.
We would like to be able to have a conversation with both sides of the issue and see what kinds of questions could be answered. And it's an ongoing process. So this was the start and provided a lot of information. And from here, cute kid, from here we'll be able to have more sessions and ask some hard questions and have people hopefully who are knowledgeable on both sides of the issue. So having the relationship that you have with Bill, or knowing and having the links, I think is really useful for that. Michelle, if we could ask if you would hang on for a minute, and we could go to Elaine, who is not on the board anymore as a member of the public. Olympia, is there anything else that you'd like to add? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for all of the information. Robert, if you could unmute Elaine and then Michelle, thank you.
Elaine, you should be unmuted.
Okay. Couple of comments. In our community, the avenues are mixed use. There is a requirement that on the street level, there be commercial, retail. But what you're now saying with these large mega buildings is that you have retail space that's very large. I think what we've been talking about is much more a smaller store, whether it's the shoemaker, dry cleaner, etc. Okay. And so we need to look at how what's happening with the new development. And if I look at 83rd and 3rd, which has a huge ground floor, it is still vacant. So they have built, but they have no tenants. And so I think it's time to look at how do we work with looking at how to make the ground floor community. And Barbara mentioned if there are no stores, it's dark. That's absolutely true. The other thing that the community board did that I was very upset with was on 2nd Avenue and 81st Street, 82nd Street, I believe it is, a new development. Well, they had a restaurant, but they had a lot of space. They had rented to a school in the basement and they wanted it on retail. That had to have a variance. And the board voted for that. I could not understand. You need retail there. Yes, there's a schools, but you don't take it away from retail. But this is what the landlords are doing, and they're making a fortune doing this. So they're skirting the rules and the regulations, and we have a community board that went along with it. It's not acceptable. What I'm asking the board to look at is beginning under small businesses. How do we look at these large developments that have all the retail space on the bottom, and how do we get them to divide it up so that moms and pops, I don't know what that term really means anymore, can come into the space and not wait for a whatever company would want to come in. And I'm not talking a bank because they're not renting to the banks, but something that is user-friendly that we need as a community resident. Thank you.
With respect to that nursery school, that school was in place before they came to the community board and was functional. And that was an issue for some of us. I met with them. They came, that developer, they have 2 buildings on 2nd Avenue, 1 block apart, and the other building is rented to a very large restaurant that always uses a lot of space. They came to the housing committee because they needed an after-hours variance to continue their late night, early morning construction. And I raised at that meeting the possibility that they maybe lease some space to a small business for less than market rate and make up for it by renting to a bank or another large business that could afford it. They looked at me as though I had landed from another planet and spoke a different language. And the only thing they said was, well, if you give us the variance, we'll consider doing something like that. So they had zero interest in that. But having said that, the high-end building on Lexington and 78th Street did carve up its downstairs space into small spaces. And it's Angelina Pastries, Venki ice cream and chocolate, and Dos Toros. So they're small, they're bright, they're really attractive spaces. And I applaud that, but a lot of the new developments are not streetscape retail in the kind that we would like to see. There's a website that was quoted in one of the law review articles called Vanishing New York, and they look at different spaces or different businesses that have gone out and what the landscape and the streetscape of New York used to look like. And one of the things I just browsed really quickly before this meeting was the Flower District. And we've seen the decimation of the Flower District for new development, a lot of tourist hotels, some new construction of housing. But there was no interest in maintaining that as a flower district. And one of the businesses that had been there for many, many years closed. And one of the reasons cited among others, was higher rent. And on my block, I saw a 59-year-old pizza place go out of business when someone else took over the landlord, I think it was a relative, and decided to make them responsible for the real estate taxes, which was not in their lease and which they hadn't been responsible for. And when they said, if you don't pay the rent, the real estate taxes, we're not leasing to you, because there was another small business that was also kicked out. They couldn't afford it and they left. And now there is a citywide pizza chain that is in that space. So it's happening all over the place. There are different kinds of businesses, but that's why Bill and I had really wanted to look at this in trying to find a way to help small businesses. And we're cognizant that not every landlord is Extell or Naftali or any of the ones that are downtown. And there are small landlords, but that when you see the chains coming in, because there was a small store, and I'm sorry, Michelle, I'll get to you in a second, on Lexington, whose rent virtually almost tripled overnight, and they retired, and it was a lovely one-off store of vintage jewelry. They are replaced by, I believe it's Dunkin' Donuts. Maybe it's another juice chain or something like that. And so we see a lot of things change in the neighborhoods. Anyway, Michelle, thank you. Elaine, is there anything else you wanted to add?
Oh, thank you for listening.
That's our job. Michelle? Thank you for your patience, Michelle.
No problem. Always happy to hear what you have to say. A few things strike me. One, I remember years ago that in order to get the larger stores on 86th Street, the zoning was changed to allow larger window, the frontage of the windows. So that may be a way, if you want to get smaller stores, is through some kind of zoning. As Elaine's shaking her head, she may have a reason for that, but let me finish what I have to say, and then I'm happy to hear what everybody says on that issue. I'm not recommending it. I'm only saying that that's what happened. The other thing is, we had talked about a small business zone. Elizabeth and again Elaine had talked about that, whereas a zone is actually put aside in a neighborhood called a small business zone. Now, what the parameters are and what the qualifications for that, that's another story to figure out how you get that and what that actually is and whether or not that works many places. But that's something to look into, because on our streets, like you take a Lexington that has a very definite character, which would be out of character for certain storefronts, might be very well in character for businesses that would qualify to be in a small business zone. The other thing is, when you're talking about people prefer to buy on Amazon than in a small store, well, there's no question it's the convenience, but the other thing it really is are the ease of returns. And I remember, the holiday time, wanting to buy from small business, but you can't, here you're giving gifts to people. And the element of return is a very, very big issue with gift giving. When you're buying for yourself, you can try it on, if you want it, if it fits. When you're buying for somebody else, you always want to be able to return. And a lot of the online stores and the department stores offer those kinds of services that the small businesses probably couldn't offer if they wanted to, just because they couldn't deal with the amount of return that they would get. And the last thing is, and Alita, I was trying to look it up while I was talking to you, and I forgot, I sent you an article about an overseas issue where they were talking about rent control. It was in Sweden or Norway.
Yes.
Where was it? Sweden,
Sweden.
right? Yeah. And the issue there was that they found that it really hurt small business. So, like everything else, the devil is in the detail. I'm not a big rent control person, like that's the answer to everything. I like to see, if I can, the free markets, do their job. But I do understand that occasionally there's tweaking and things that you may have to do. But as I say, the devil is always in the detail. And that's why you really have to read these bills, because what is it that they are actually proposing and for how long? And also, what's the exit strategy? You know, very often we have bills or programs or whatever, they're implemented in good faith, but then there's no way to get out. You know, we find that it's not working or whatever, or it needs to be tweaked, and you can't undo it because the bureaucracy is set up to keep it going. So it's a cautionary tale. And when we do additional research and we hear from people with knowledge in this area, I look forward to that discussion. Thank you.
Yes, and I think it's important because I know the question that you raised about issues with rent control, whether it's residential or commercial, is something that's raised as a negative. So it would be interesting to be able to look at that much more closely and see what's really going on. Valerie had earlier raised an interesting point, which I also had written down as a question. There's a lot of anticipation that with congestion pricing, that prices, although she raised it in different contexts, my question was more with congestion pricing, as prices go up because delivery trucks will now be charged every time they go into the zone, how will that impact the ability of small businesses to survive, particularly if rents are escalating? And the idea we had toyed with the idea, I think last year, of having a meeting on the financial aspects, because my understanding is that when if you're charging $10,000 a month rent and you have a mortgage from a bank and you can't get a tenant and you want to lower it to $8,000 a month, the bank may think that or may consider it a default and call in the loan. That's an issue. If landlords possibly decide that they would rather rent, Brad had mentioned this, to what they might consider a more secure tenant, such as a franchise or a bank, rather than a small, untried, untested store. Those are issues. So there are a lot of considerations here. This was just the first step in this bill. You jump in anytime, I can go on. So this is just a first step, but we want to really explore it because small businesses are what make New York, New York, and what make the Upper East Side different from the Upper West Side, different from Tribeca, different from Brooklyn Heights, different from Woodside in Queens. And for me and many other people, it's important to be able to keep that neighborhood character intact or vibrant. And that's another reason. It's rent control for small business is a citywide issue. Protecting small businesses is a citywide issue, even though it's reflected in what's going on in our own neighborhood. Valerie, did you have anything else you wanted to add, Michelle? Okay, I guess you've already been muted. Valerie?
Well, yeah, I just want to focus, which I think, again, everyone is sort of losing sight of, and I don't mean everyone on this call, I just mean the city at large. Manhattan is still the last borough rebounding from what happened during COVID. And while all of these incentives have been given to the other boroughs, I don't want to call it the other boroughs, and they have in fact benefited by the fact that some people in their boroughs are working from home, we have not had any of that subsidy, if you will. In fact, it's the exact opposite. If you have to pay the commercial rent tax, and that goes for what the MTA is characterizing the central business district, as well as the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side, and you had a choice of opening a business in a region that didn't have that tax, you would certainly do it. And as far as the landlords go, I mean, it is a real truth that they actually cannot rent at a lower rate, a lower rent, if they have a mortgage on their building. The loan to value ratio is immediately impacted, and it results in increased interest rates for their loans. And so, as crazy as it sounds, they financially cannot afford to do this rent. And you know, I want to give a shout out to Alex Boris, because he was the one who sort of turned me on to this REAP program, where for many years this program encourages Manhattan businesses below 96th Street to relocate above 96th Street and in the other boroughs for certain tax credits. And so what is going to be left on the island of Manhattan for local residents to use? I mean, to Barbara's point, I'm one of those people who want to go into my local shop. I very rarely order from anywhere, just as a personal protest, because the money that Uber and all the rest of it, Seamless, takes from both the shop owner and their treatment of the people who are riding those bicycles is just abysmal. And I try to avoid it at all costs. You know, it's incredible to me that we're not focused on the fact that these businesses are leaving Manhattan. And I have to say, from what I understand from people in the Central Business District, a lot of businesses are already positioning themselves outside of the Central Business District, moving, you know, if they're in Lower Manhattan, moving to Brooklyn, where there is no commercial rent tax, there is no congestion pricing problem, and they're going to use Brooklyn as a hub for deliveries. And I don't know what the last mile involves coming up from Brooklyn over the bridge, but you know, this is a real issue, especially for people in our neighborhoods who cannot get on a subway or cannot get on public transportation. And how are they going to get their goods and services? And I really think it's something to really look at, because the small businesses are, I mean, I almost was hoping that we would come up with a program. I mean, I'm not interested in looking at the commercial rent tax more, but some program where perhaps in the smaller buildings, in order to, you even think about it, if you have a successful small business and you're in a in a 5-story building, as soon as your business starts to take off, you have to be worrying, oh my gosh, how much longer am I going to be in my lease? How can what do I have to do? And I was just, if, you talk about programs, why can't there be like a loan to own program for small business owners to buy their spaces, to condo their spaces, or if older landlords who own these buildings, at least give them an opportunity to try to buy their space, and to give them the ammunition to combat with the larger national retailers. Because look, if you're a landlord, you can't really fault somebody for saying, well, even if this business venture doesn't take off within the space, at least I know I have a national chain that's going to back up the rental payments. I mean, we have to at least give them that. I mean, but look, many of these businesses, these mom and pop businesses, and I came from a community where there were tons of them, are just folding now because there's no interest in continuing them. And their owners have happily reached the age of retirement and just, don't want to work any longer. And it's a sad fact. So, I mean, I think we should really look at these, and I know we've passed many resolutions regarding the commercial rent tax, but I think that the environment is changing, and I see no reason why Manhattan is and our neighborhoods in particular are being singled out for this. So I'll stop at that.
It has been an issue. Before we go back, well, Rita had raised her hand. I just want to mention that the rent control was suggested or proposed by Ruth Messenger back in the 1980s. And there was a commission, I think it was the Small Retail Business Study Commission, and they came up with a number of proposals. They didn't like the idea of commercial rent control, but they came up with a number of them. But what they did say emphatically was that doing nothing was not the right solution, and the city needed to do something. There could be financial support for small businesses. There could be zoning changes requiring small businesses in different spaces. There could be a lot of things done. And it seems like this is a time to revisit some of the old suggestions, think about new ones because of the changing landscape, the impact of congestion pricing. I don't think anyone says that there won't be an impact, and all assorted other issues. These are citywide. They do reflect in our neighborhood and in with economic gentrification as well. So thank you for raising all of those points, Valerie. Statistics would be helpful too. If we could go to Rita, Robert, thank you.
With congestion pricing, it's going to be passed on to the consumer. And
Yes.
then that will make it impossible to shop there. So that will drive you to an Amazon. So it's like a vicious cycle. I have to tell you, tonight I learned something that I didn't know, and I'm upset that I now know it. And that is that a bill that's passed in this session, if that person is, if that council person is not there, not reelected, that bill can die. So I don't understand that. I keep thinking that we're reinventing the wheel all the time, and the reason that in some buildings, in small buildings with the rent, it depends on what the lease is, and most of those people, most of the owners want to sell the building, so therefore they give a short-term lease, and people who are going to invest in building a business won't take it. So that's another problem. But this was very informative. Thank you, and I'm glad that my family is not in retail anymore.
Okay.
Evelyn, go ahead.
Evelyn.
Yeah, I'm gonna quickly address the legislative procedure, and then I'm gonna jump off. Not passed, not a bill that has passed will become law. Is a bill that is introduced, would have to be reintroduced in the next session.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being here with us this whole time, for offering your insights and your knowledge, for being available for future conversations, and for sending all of the information.
Thank you again, and we'll be in touch.
Great, thank you.
Bye-bye.
I just want to say one thing in response to what Rita had said, which is one of the, I think, the real impacts of the kind of development and gentrification, economic gentrification, as more affluent people move into neighborhoods, is that it does put a lot of pressure on real estate prices and on business building owners, small building owners, to warehouse their buildings in order to be able to sell them for a lot of money, because a building with a lease that can't be terminated is not worth as much as a building with empty spaces or leases that can be terminated. And that's something that doesn't get enough consideration either in discussions about changes and development. So with all of that, is there anyone else who would like to say anything? I'm sure, Bill, you have some closing words too.
Well, you all raised very interesting point. So we could be like ongoing discussion, and we will try to do whatever we can, find different ways to support the small businesses. We want them to thrive and be very successful. So there might be an alternative other than commercial rent control. So we need to consider. So if nothing else, so we'll put a motion to conclude.
Anyone want to make a motion? Michelle does, seconds, Rita does. And I'll just say that just keep track of our schedule, because we're going to be having a series of these meetings, and maybe the next one will be a continuing discussion of rent control for and against. So thank you everyone for staying with us and participating to such a good extent.
Thank you for your time. Take care.
And thank you, Robert, and thank you, Will. Bye, everyone.